This is Learn from Others, where we interview a cross-section of successful individuals so you can learn from their experiences, achievements, and even their mistakes. We ask 4 questions that will educate and inspire. Greg Stanley will be your guide as we join our guest on a journey from adolescent daydreaming to success in today's world. Join us on this adventure as we learn from others together.
Welcome to Learn from Others, where we help others succeed by sharing success. I'm very excited to introduce our special guest, Larry Shushansky. Larry, how are you doing today?
Good, Greg. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Well, before we find out what you're actually doing today, if you would, could you please tell me, what did you want to be when you grew up?
So when I was about 8, 9, or 10 years old, I had this idea that I wanted to help the world. I'd listened to newscasts that my father would listen to on the nightly news, and I heard all this horrible stuff that was going on, and I thought that if people would listen to me, that I could solve the world's problems. Now, that was pretty naive for sure, and I didn't have what it took to make much of a difference in the world, that's for sure. But as I entered middle school and into high school, I had a number of English teachers who were really inspirational for me, and they encouraged me to write. So I started to write, and back then it was mostly love poems and short stories about, the things that adolescents go through. They weren't any good at all. But once I graduated high school, I went into college, and I pursued writing there. And I wrote a number of things, and some were good, some were actually pretty good. Most of them were just slock. They weren't really good at all, but I didn't understand that what you needed to do was write and write and write and write and write and write and write. In addition to that, I got involved with a lot of alcohol and a lot of drugs, and I flunked out of college.
Wow.
And at that point, it was the late 60s, early 70s, and they had the draft lottery in the United States. And Greg, it's the only thing I've won in my life was the draft lottery.
Are you kidding? Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah, it was pretty nuts, I got to tell you. So I ended up going into the service, and for about 3 or 4 years, and when I got out, I went back to school with a renewed sense of purpose, because I had thought that the reason I'd gone into the service was because I had messed up. I had flunked out of school, and they had school deferments back then. So I was determined not to ever be in that position again. So I went back to school. I'm driving to school one day, and I'm thinking in my head, this is where this 8 or 9, 10-year-old idea of helping the world comes out. This idea, this spark hit me that I wanted to do some volunteer work. And as I'm driving to class, this advertisement on the asking for volunteers for a rape crisis center came on the radio. So I called them the next day. I did an 8-week training with them, and I absolutely fell in love with therapy and clinical work and helping people at that level. Plus, I did a lot of presentations in the community, at schools, and in businesses around rape awareness. So that when I graduated undergraduate school at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia, I went to graduate school. I got a master's degree in clinical social work. I moved up north and got a few jobs up in this area and met the woman that I eventually married. And we've been married for about 36 years. I've got an older son who's 39. I've got a middle son who is 33, and I've got a daughter who's 31.
Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. So I settled down pretty well, actually. And the dream, or this idea of me being a writer, never left me. And this idea of wanting to help people never left me. So I continue to do psychotherapy in for-profit and nonprofit hospitals and organizations and emergency rooms and for the courts and just anywhere that I thought I could be helpful. But at the same time, I set up a writing room where we raised our family. And it's my own private room. And I got to tell you, I wrote hundreds, if not thousands of pages I wrote haikus, and I wrote poems, and I wrote short stories. I even wrote a novella once. I had writing coaches. I went to conferences both in the United States and out of the United States, because I still had this idea that I wanted to be a writer. So I pursued and pursued, but over 30 some odd years, I never got a single thing published, nothing at all. But I continued to do my therapy. I actually went into private practice instead of having daycare for our 3 children. I stayed at home during the day with my kids my wife was a music teacher, and when she'd come home in the afternoon, I would go in to do the office at night. So the flexible schedule really worked well for me. So what happened is let me back up for 1 second. I carried a virus with me, hepatitis C, for 40 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
without me really knowing it, it made me very draggy, made me tired. I wasn't clear thinking. I'd often have to take a nap, and I really didn't know what was going on until I was diagnosed. 3 years ago, after having been in two treatment trials, which almost killed me, like with ribavirin and interferon, for example, which are really brutal treatments for this. It makes you really super depressed and fatigued, and it was hard for me to do my work. But I came out of those okay. And 3 years ago, I was in a clinical trial, and in 2 weeks, the virus was gone. Absolutely, it was like a miracle, I got to tell you. For the first time in my life, I actually was introduced to myself for the first time. That's how I felt. I was clear thinking. I had energy. I didn't have to take naps anymore. And that's when I started to write this book on relationships. And I got some people around me to help me. And it got published 2 years later.
And before we go a little deeper into your book, why don't you kind of, I know you mentioned what you wanted to be when you grew up, and you talked to it a little bit. Let's talk about the role you have as a psychotherapist. How long have you been doing that role?
I've been doing that for about 40 years. The interesting thing about this desire to be a writer, that once I started to write this book and actually publish it, I realized I didn't want to be a writer at all. That was kind of an idealistic kind of picture that I had in my head. And as I wrote this book and got it out and done more speaking engagements, I've realized that spark I had at an 8, 9, or 10-year-old kid is exactly what I want to do. So my purpose became clear, and that's what I do. And I do clinical social work now. I have a private practice, but I also do talks around. I do a lot of that.
So most of our audience are students. Could you go into a little bit exactly what you do, how you do it, what your day in the week of, how your work week goes? I don't know that they're all as familiar with how it works in an everyday practice type of an environment.
So I got out of graduate school and I started to working for agencies for about 10 years. I worked for a residential agency for adolescents. I started the family therapy component there. And I also, for a year or two, I directed the adolescent unit as well. Then I worked for a private hospital. Then I worked for some family service organizations. I directed outpatient services for a mental health center. I worked in emergency capacities and in hospitals. I went into people's homes and did evaluations. And I think those first 10 years, kind of doing the work I needed to do. And by the way, I wasn't making a lot of money. I can remember my first job, I made $18,500 a year.
Wow.
Yeah,
wow.
It was pretty amazing. But the experience I gained, and I think that was the issue for me, was absolutely immense. Absolutely immense. So once I started having children, like I said, I opened my own private practice. And now with my kids older and most of my friends are retired or semi-retired, I work full time. The nice part about the clinical work for me, well, let me back up a second. The first 10 years formed me as a therapist. It gave me a wide berth of experience with what some people call walking well to chronic patients in hospital settings and large state hospitals and everywhere in between. And I just absolutely loved it. And I kept growing and growing and growing as a clinician until I was ready to be at a stage where I could start my own private practice. The nice part about private practice for me is the flexibility and time. Although it's a lot of work, it's a lot of effort, and I still stay well connected to colleagues for, occasional supervision that I need or just to run by a case here and there. But I basically go in the office. I do hour by hour. I see about 30 clients a week, which is really nice for me. And the rest of the time, I do speaking engagements and podcasts and radio programs like we're doing today.
So now when a client comes into your office, is it family oriented? Is it any type of relationship? How do you define that? Or is it all over the spectrum?
For me, it's all over the spectrum. I'm what they call a generalist. I specialize in family and mostly marital and premarital counseling. that's mostly what I do. That's most of the people that I see during the week, and I absolutely love it. That's how I got the idea for the book, and just seeing so many couples and being married for 35 years. So it works that somebody comes in and sees me. I don't have a specific theory that I work off of, although my idea about relationships is very theory oriented. I usually there's a social work addict that you always start where the client is, and that's what I do. So sometimes I can be very confrontational. Sometimes I'm more laid back. Sometimes I don't talk a lot. Sometimes I talk a lot. Sometimes I'm strategic. Sometimes I use what they call CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. Sometimes I use family systems. I'm pretty eclectic, and my that comes from me getting a feel of what somebody needs versus me imposing on them what I think they should have.
That's really cool. And I like how you mentioned that 10 years of foundational groundwork you had for your career really helped you out now. I mean,
Uh,
because you're so well rounded.
I can't express enough, and I'm thinking that it's just not psychotherapy. I'm thinking just about any career. You really want, not that you need to, but you really want to get into I guess the old cliche is trenches, just to get the experience. And just the more experience you get, the more mature you become in whatever you're doing. In my field, the more mature of a clinician. And I'm still growing. I got to tell you, I still, look back at my day and look at some of the sessions that I had and how they went and what I could have done better and what I could have done differently and those kinds of things. So I'm constantly moving forward.
That's great. Great way to look at it. As a reminder, you can check out all previous episodes at learnfromothers.org. And if you're an educator or a student, you can search for podcasts by career cluster. So we learned what you wanted to be when you grew up, which was to help people, and what you do today, which is helping people. So
Right.
looking back on all of it, what would you do differently?
So what would I do differently? I would divide that into two categories for me. One would be in my private life and one would be professionally. In my private life, as I look back at my life, I would be kinder in my relationships, much kinder in my relationships. The only regrets that I carry with me at 68 years old is that I wasn't kind in certain relationships that I was in. We're having a 50th high school reunion coming October. I got to tell you, Greg, when I saw that email and it invited me to my 50th reunion, I almost passed out. I couldn't believe it had been 50 years. But as I look back, and there's a Facebook page for our high school reunion, and some of the folks I haven't talked to in 40, 50 years, I look back at some of those relationships. And again, the only regrets I've had in life is that I just wasn't nicer or kinder in my relationships. Professionally, I got to tell you, I have no regrets. And you've probably heard this a number of times from people who've talked to, because for me, everything I've done, everything I've went through, good, bad, or indifferent, all of it has got me to the point where I'm at now. Even most of the things in my personal life, with all the difficulties and all the ups and downs and overs and unders I've been through, everything got me to where I am now. There's a great little book. It's not so little. It's called The Life Unlived. And so it's about the choices we've made and the lives that we have to leave behind. A lot of times we fantasize about what we could have done, and I could have been in a different relationship, could have had a different career, could have made more money, could have done this if I would have done that kind of thing. But the reality is that we are who we are because of what we've done in the past and what we're currently doing now. So that's my answer. I wouldn't do anything differently.
And that's a great place to be, knowing that after all the heartache, headaches, overcoming obstacles, all the different things you had that challenge you and your career, that you're good where you are because you learn from them. So that's a great place to be.
Right. And I continue to learn from them.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a process for sure.
Yeah. Well, what advice would you give someone who wants to do what you do?
Well, I think there's a number of ways of doing this. There's a book by a woman named Barbara Scheer. It's called Wishcraft that she put up decades ago. And she never went to college. She never went to school. But she does, at that point, she was traveling nationally. She was giving talks. She was doing presentations. And she did it without a degree. I could not have done what I'm doing without a degree. I needed to get an undergraduate degree. I needed to get a master's degree. Now, I chose a master's in social work versus a PhD, simply because back then I didn't have the money, and a PhD program was longer than an MSW program. But I'm glad I did. It's more of a practical degree, I think, than getting a PhD in clinical psychology. Now, clinical psychologists wouldn't agree with me, but it's getting the proper degree and then getting as much good experience as possible. And I think that's what carries the day. And I think that's what separates some really good therapists from the mediocre or actually bad therapists. It's getting the experience after you get the degrees that you need. And part of the degrees for me has been reimbursable. I've needed to have this MSW, although there's 4 or 5 other reimbursable degrees, in order to make a living, because it's nice to help people, but I also need to make a living at it as well.
Right, exactly. That's great advice, talking about the different types of degrees. Really identify what is needed for your end goal more than anything else. That's
right.
Great.
Well, the interesting part for me is I didn't know my end goal until a couple of years ago. That it was really
a lot of folks are like that.
Yeah, and they talk about, a lot of research and a lot of books will talk about finding your purpose. And for me, my purpose came through a process of living, trying to explore and find that purpose. And it only took me, 50 years to find out that I didn't want to be a writer, but that I wanted to do more in helping people. But that's really helped me get out in the community and do more talks and more presentations and those kinds of things. So I've been really grateful for that.
Well, speaking of which, about not wanting to be a writer, are there any current projects you're working on that you would like to share?
Well, I do a blog. I do a regular blog. I really enjoy doing those a lot. And I write periodically for NAMI, which is National Alliance for Mentally Ill. I write a blog for them. I've done one hardcover magazine article for them. I've done one national presentation for them. So my writing has more to do with blogging than anything else. I have been quoted in, things like the Boston Globe and Chicago Tribune. I had an article a few years back in the Huffington Post and those kinds of things. But generally speaking, I write my own blog, which I really, really enjoy because they're short and they're to the point, and I really enjoy doing those. And then I do mostly presentations. Does that answer your question?
It does. Yeah, you still have writing in your life, but it's not necessarily your profession. It's more of an enjoyment, a hobby, an outlet.
Absolutely, right.
That's a big difference, and it's a good thing you realize that.
And it's a way of helping people as well. You get a lot of positive feedback on the blogs.
Absolutely. That's great. Well, you just took us on your career journey, and as with most journeys, success largely depends on reliable transportation. And we don't know each other, but I'm a huge car enthusiast, and our pre-call, I learned what your first car was. So could you please tell our audience, what was your first car?
My first car was a metallic green, 3-speed, 1971 Ford Mustang.
That's awesome. My first car was a 1968 3-speed 6-cylinder Ford Mustang.
Seriously?
Yeah.
No kidding. Was it souped up at all, or?
No, it was as basic. It has an exhaust leak. It was as basic as it got, and it was red. It wasn't green.
Red. I remember that Mustang, the '68 Mustang. It was really nice. The year I bought my Mustang, the '71, they had changed styles.
Big. That's a big Mustang.
Yeah. It wasn't the same thing as the really cute ones that you got. Did you enjoy it?
Oh yeah, absolutely loved it. It was great, and I recently sold my 66 Mustang Convertible about a year ago.
Oh, no kidding. Did you reverb it? Did you redo it?
Yeah, redid it and everything else. Really enjoyed it. I'll send you a video on YouTube.
I would love to see it.
Well, what's your dream car if you have one?
My dream car might be that 71 Mustang, I got to tell you.
But with a V8, right?
Or with a V8, maybe 351 V8. That's exactly.
There you go.
Right. Something a little awesome. More soup on it.
Right. Well, one great perk to some jobs is having a company car. So if I had all the money in the world, I'd love to get you a cool company car based on your job. So I actually went with your recently published book, Independent Enough, and I took your first sentence that it's a book about relationships. And I know that, your job is helping people relate better in their relationships. So I thought, well, what was not the worst relationship in the automotive world, but what was one of the more strained relationships in the automotive world? And so I fell on Ford and his son, Edsel. So they had a little bit of a strained relationship back in the early days of Ford. I don't know if you know this or not, but
No.
Ford Sr. did not want to change the Model T. Had been in production for 18 years. He didn't see any reason to change it, even though Chevrolet and everyone else was coming out with cooler cars that weren't always black, and they had a lot of options. And so Edsel wanted to come out with the Model T, the Model A, the successor to the Model T, and he wanted to add colors and all this kind of stuff. And he actually ended up winning that battle, but it was a battle with his dad. And so they had bad relationships. And so anyways, I decided, you know what, I'm going to pick the coolest Edsel ever for you. Now, most Edsels, if you know those cars, they're not the prettiest cars in the world. But
Yep.
Edsel actually made a one-off 1938 Model 40 Special Speedster as a prototype. So this is the first year they had the V8 Ford engine.
Look at
So I'll
that.
send you a picture, and it's a gorgeous two-seater roadster with a boat tail rear end that's in a museum somewhere right now. So that's the car I picked for you if I had all the money in the world to get you a company car.
Greg, I'll take it.
All right.
It's interesting that you said that because I think, a lot of us as men do battles with our fathers. And what you just described was the son became, and I had to say cliches, but he became independent enough to do what he needed to do, even though his father didn't want him to. And I think in order to become healthy and mature and adult-like and make good decisions, we got to do those kind of battles with our family of origins and grow past it and become much more independent. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's interesting because I think in relationships, in order to be in the kind of relationships we want, we have to look at ourselves and then create the kinds of relationships we want, regardless of what somebody else does. Like Ford's son you just described, his father was not a passive man for sure, very aggressive, very business oriented. And you can imagine he did a lot of confrontation, but regardless of what his father did or said, he was able to do what he needed to do to be successful on his own. That's a great story. Thanks for sharing that with me.
Yeah, and it just worked out great that your first car was also a Ford. So
A
that's
Ford.
kinda cool.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for taking us on your journey today. What's the best way our listeners can learn more about you and what you do?
Well, if they wanted to, they could go to independentenough.com. It's my website. That's the best way. And also any other social media, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Independent Enough.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, thank you so much for taking us on your career journey today, Larry.
Well, you're welcome, Greg. And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Learn from Others, where we help others succeed by sharing success. Where will our next adventure take us? Subscribe to find out. If you know of someone who has a cool career story or occupation, contact Greg through Instagram at Greg Stanley LFO. That's GregStanley LFO. And we will see you soon as we learn from others together.